Overpopulation, are we actually suffering from it? And if not, what's the biggest threat to the world we currently live in today? It's a huge topic. I've currently just finished it in geography right now for my A levels, so I can give you quite a few statistics and some interesting thoughts on it. Why did we choose this topic? I guess it's the most current topic that we can talk about outside of the World Cup and other issues that we've already talked about before. We have a
And I
few,
think
yeah,
I was
Karen.
going to say recently the UN have said we've hit 8 billion people, world population.
I believe it was the 15th of November.
Yes, something like that.
Yeah.
So this is hopefully Dylan will shed light on a very important issue and shed light on more issues.
Yeah, sure. So, obviously, as I said, we've been doing this in geography over the last like 2, 3 months. So it's a really interesting issue actually, because um, a lot of people say that we are suffering from overpopulation, as you see in the last. Let's take a look at the history, right? If we look at the history 10,000 years ago to now, there was a lot of infectious diseases, so things like the diseases that you see in like sub-Saharan Africa and places like that where they hit vulnerable people. They're not things like degenerative diseases that we sort of have in the UK, where it's diseases because you're obese or something like that that you get. These are infectious diseases caused by like insects, by mosquitoes, parasites, things like that. So essentially, there was controlled death rates in the first and most of the second millennium that we live in now. And only after the Industrial Revolution, where sanitation really increased, there was a sharp upturn in population growth. Then came the 1950s after the war, where the next sharp upturn in population occurred because of the baby boom. And then what happened was actually birth rates decreased in many high income countries because of the contraception advancements in the 1960s, but still in the LICs, which is known as low income countries, so your places like in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, South Sudan, Ethiopia, those places, and you could technically say Botswana as well as places in Asia like Bangladesh. The fertility rates, which is basically how many people are born per thousand women, they were still quite high. So essentially, when we talk about overpopulation over the span over the last 2,000 years, it's a lot of variation. We can't actually say that we're suffering from overpopulation as a global phenomenon because that's just not true. We look at Japan, they're actually having a decline in population because of the aging population. We look at the UK, we look at the US, they're going to experience declines. But then you look at Nigeria, you look at the DRC, they're going to experience their sharp upturn. So when we talk about population as a whole, I think our overall line of inquiry is going to be there's a lot of variation. So how can we tackle this issue on a global scale when there's variation?
So looking at it from a historical point of view, I just remembered when talking about it, I just got out my history folder. We've been looking at this thing called the Malthus, a thesis.
Thomas Malthus, yes.
Yes, Reverend Thomas Malthus,
Yes,
and
yes,
it
yes, yes.
the idea that there are natural checks that will keep people and food in line
Mm.
over a certain period, and that population growth will always tend to outrun the food supply, and that it's the sorry, and I'll look at Britannica. Now, it's the betterment of humankind. So, according to Britannica, the population growth will always tend to outrun the food supply, and that betterment of humankind is impossible without strict limits on reproduction.
Yes.
So, Malthus injects almost a fear of pessimism because he was writing this post, in 1798 in an essay called The Principle of Population. And he believes that if we cannot rely on natural checks that keep people in order, so that is war, famine, and disease, then we should move to non-natural and we should impose unnatural checks, such as things, as you were talking about, the development of contraception and different things like that.
But there's
And
also things such as population policies. For example, many of you would know about the one-child policy that was put into China. There was also the two-children policy, I believe, in Singapore. There was the family planning program in Bangladesh. There's quite a few government natalist policies that they can include. That's also an example.
yeah, so I was just wondering, was Malthus correct in your opinion? was the idea, according to Britannica, the population growth will always tend to outrun the food supply, and the betterment of humankind is impossible without strict limits on reproduction, correct?
That's a very difficult question. Was Malthus correct? I don't think we can say yet, because there's another opposing idea of Esther Boserup, and she essentially said that due to the rise in technology, that will allow us to ensure that the resources keep up with the population growth. So if we look at a graph, actually, it's basically an arithmetic graph, an arithmetic line versus a geometric line. And essentially what that means is resources will either increase or stay the same at the same linear rate, whereas population will usually go in a J curve. So there'll be a
Yeah.
point where the resources, if they are over the population, that means you're going to basically have underconsumption, or it's sort of underpopulation. Then you're going to reach an optimum point where you've got the optimum and most efficient size, resource consumption, and efficiency, maximum efficiency of the population using the resources. But then you're going to overhit that, and that's when you get overpopulation, when there's too many people, and that's when you get overconsumption, right? You get too many people who are eating from just the same amount of resources or using the same amount of resources, but they aren't growing at the same rate.
Yeah. So
So
it's the idea that food will rise arithmetically whilst
arithmetically,
population will rise geometrically.
yeah, essentially. And what it basically says is, well, Malthus or Ehrlich, when he wrote the book The Population Bomb in 1963, I believe, um, he's known as a neo-Malthusian, which basically states that he sort of reincorporated those ideas back into after World War One and World War Two. He essentially said that when we reach that point of no return, there will be natural checks that sort of sustain the population. So these can be known as black swan events. For example, the world wars could be considered that. COVID could be considered that. Famines, genocides, they could be considered that. It's things like that which essentially keep the population below and in check. Whether
Yeah.
I agree with that or not, I don't know yet, because if we actually look at, while, as I said, I come back to my overall line of inquiry and my overall thinking. If we look at past the 1960s, the HICs, which have already experienced their revolution, for example, industrialization and everything, they've been on the either plateauing and then on the decline. It's the LICs that haven't experienced their revolution or their development through, for example, a model that we can use like the demographic transition model. Um, if we look at the UK, Japan, US, they're all in stage 4 to 5, which means they're the most developed countries in the world. We look at India, they're experiencing probably stage 3 to 4. We look at China again, 3 to 4. They're our world superpowers right now, and they're still growing. Well, India's supposed to surpass China because of China's economic constraints due to the one child policy. But essentially, I don't think Malthus is right, because you can't just generalize to the whole world that there's going to be we're all go like globally we're going to exceed, because as I said, there's so much variation. But then I don't think Boserup was right either about technology being the answer to increase resources to match population control. An example of that is the Green Revolution. I don't know, have you heard about the Green Revolution?
I have not.
So basically this farmer in Mexico, he wanted to let me get my notes up, actually, this is probably easier. So the Green Revolution, essentially what it was is, this farmer in Mexico, he wanted to increase the resources, so he modified the type of wheat that they would produce and the type of rice into dwarf wheat, and that meant less would be killed off by diseases and things, so therefore there's more resources for the people to eat. So over a time, he managed to do this, and he basically he introduced a monoculture, which means growing the same thing over and over again, and just that one thing, and it
Yeah.
worked. And it basically meant that there was more resources. And at this time, he was also trying to help. And because he realized the success of this, he then tried to push this out to India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, because at those times they were facing extreme famine and extreme starvation. So to help save that, he then exported all of that from Mexico to that area, and then introduced those same techniques there. Now, this is
Yeah.
known as the Green Revolution, because it basically changed the way that people farmed. Unfortunately, the unforeseen impacts of the Green Revolution have essentially led to a lot of degradation and infertility of land, which means now farming right now is really difficult. So instead, one of the solutions to that is using technology. Instead of going horizontal farming, so using all the land, we now have to go vertical or use different types of greenhouses. Or using, for example, if we were to go vegetarian or limit our meat consumption naturally, we would make meat made in a lab. So there's different technological solutions from that. So essentially, whether Bosrup would say that's been a success or not, I don't know. Because while the Green Revolution had a very good short-term impact, long-term it's been pretty disastrous, I won't lie. But the solutions coming out of that are pretty self-explanatory based off the Green Revolution sort of blueprint. So
Yeah.
while I think Bosrup is not fully right in the sense of saying technology is the sole solution to increasing our resources to match population control, it's definitely an important factor in that. I think the most important factor is about education of consumption and education on sort of like the three biggest factors of population change, which is birth rate, your fertility rates, your death rate, your mortality rates, and your migration rates. So, Anu, what do you understand by migration?
So it's the flow of people moving in and out of a certain region, I'd say, rather than I wouldn't want to restrict it to a country, but yeah, a certain region. So migration in and out of London, maybe in and out of England, in and out of Europe, and yeah, that's how I would define it.
Yeah, so migration is essentially the definition I would use is the permanent change of residence of a person either within a border, internally or internationally between a border, and for a sustained period of time. Essentially, that's sort of what I would use. It's pretty similar to what you said. And migration has really impacted. If you look at the 1700s, the migration patterns were very much Europe and conquest to like Central America, South America, or the slave trade from Africa and India to Latin America and North America. Right now, you've got a lot of patterns from South America and India into Qatar and the Middle East region, or to Eastern Europe, or into Europe, main like the UK, Germany, France, and then you've also got the Latin American, Central American countries into the US. They're the three main migration patterns.
Yeah,
So when we also talk about overpopulation, we need to talk about how that's being influenced by not just the birth rates, how many people are being born in the country. We need to talk about not just how many people are dying, and less people are dying, or let's say more people are living older because of the advances in medical infrastructure, but also the migration rates and why, for example, while we were part of the EU and having that free movement across, that meant there was a lot more migrants moving across to the UK. And now that, when Suella Braverman has talked about, her comments regarding migrants and everything, and wanting to introduce, and then how Priti Patel introduced those hard borders and this point system, which made it harder to migrate, how that's influenced the UK in terms of its population. So I guess the overall then question is, how does these three things link to overpopulation or link to population as a whole?
yeah.
Um, why don't you try and tackle that? How does fertility link to overpopulation, sort of?
So I think probably fertility. I don't know. Just just hearing it, it probably seems like the simplest. So it's the idea that there's with increased fertility means more births per capita, therefore, or not, yeah, more births per women are giving more births per person, therefore there'll be more children, therefore leading to an increase in population. I think I forgot what your second point was, but I think in terms of migration, I think obviously you talked about movement between different countries, different continents, and I think maybe aspects of that could that be considered brain drain? So it's the migration of qualified individuals from a particular country to another country in order to achieve a better life in many ways. So you see that quite a lot with Indians going to the US and different things like that. And so that's obviously something that may increase population. But whether it links to overpopulation, I don't know. I'm not sure about the real nitty gritty statistics of it. Then, yeah, I forgot you. Opposite of fertility is
Mortality.
mortality. Um, we have an aging population in the UK and internationally. I think that I think it's safe to say that there is an aging population. People are living longer than they ever used to before. I think between 2000 and 2016, there was an increase in the average lifespan of a person by 5.5 years. Um, and that's just an astonishing figure. Therefore, since people are living longer, ultimately you have more people living at a planet or on the planet at the same time. So if you go back 200 years ago, then the notion of living with your great grandparents may have been something inconceivable.
Mm.
However, now it's quite common among many families. And I think that all links to the idea that there is almost too many people at one point on Earth. However, an idea that combats this in many ways is the one, I don't know, is one Elon Musk talks about quite fondly. And he says that rather, though there may be an overpopulation crisis currently occurring now, in the future, in the next 100 or so years, there will be a population decrease, and it'll be a rapid one due to the fact people in their 20s and 30s currently aren't having children at the same rate they were 100 years ago.
Hmm.
Um, Therefore, yeah, I don't really have that much to say about this. Maybe we should ask our geographer in the house.
Mm.
But um, yeah, so Dylan, what do you think the overpopulation currently in the UK is something we should be worried about, or rather, should we be worried about population depletion?
So when we talk about overpopulation, I think I want to make this clear. I think overpopulation is mainly prevalent in LICs. So you look at Uganda, they're suffering from overpopulation, and it's a very youthful population, which basically means majority. So I think around 58% of their population is under 30.
Yeah,
Um, so that basically means there's a high dependency ratio, which basically essentially says you've got so many young people depending on a little amount of people who work. That's the problem of overpopulation, and that's mainly experienced in LICs, so low income countries, as I've explained. Underpopulation will start to occur in HICs because of the aging population currently being experienced. An example of that is Japan. So Japan, they're experiencing a population decline, and actually, funnily enough, it's funny because they've tried to introduce incentives to make women want to have children more, but women now want to focus on their careers instead and say having kids is actually not a benefit to their careers. So there's that real choice because of the enfranchisement of women right now, which is obviously a benefit in terms of just culture wise. So when we talk about overpopulation, I think that's a threat to LICs. Coming back to your question of HICs and worried about um kids, I don't think we should be too worried purely because the best thing that we have to our advantage is the greatest education resources in the world. The UK, the most developed countries are usually the most educated countries, and they have the best systems of technology, etc. So being able to make informed choices in that area, while the balance of power may shift in terms of, if we look at 2050, the projections are China, India, Nigeria. They're going to be your three main superpowers in the world. Russia maybe, US not so much anymore. So in terms of that, maybe that's a little bit of a worry, just because economically we might not be the once great power that we were, but then maybe 20, 30 years on from that, because of population momentum, we might be. Is it a worry because of the decline? I wouldn't say so, because UK is one of the most attractive destinations to migrants, regardless of what Suella Braverman and our Home Secretaries in the past have said. It is still, you look at the amount of migrants wanting to cross from the channel, through the channel from
yeah,
France.
even during dire circumstances.
Exactly. You look at the amount of people who want to come to Britain, regardless of the circumstances which they're put in and the situations which they'll have to encounter. The UK is one of the biggest destinations, which is the most attractive. Look at the amount of diversity we have, the culture we have, the opportunities of work, the job opportunities. While that may take away from local ones, I think migration is key to this. I think migration will lead to the fact that the UK won't experience a suffering like Japan might instead. because I feel like Japan is more attractive to your elderly because of the just culture around it, the lifestyle that you live, etc. So for the UK and the US, I don't think experiencing a population decrease is necessarily the worst thing in the world. I think it might actually be a little beneficial. But I guess that sort of rounding off this half of our views on population, to conclude, overpopulation isn't a global threat. It's very much There's very much variation within the world.